Welcome. Thank you for joining me today as we're in part 4 of our series on the book of Jonah. Let me tell you a little story to begin with. Here's this fellow standing at a bar just looking at his drink for like a solid half hour. He just stares at it. Suddenly a big troublemaker type guy steps up next to him, takes the drink and chugs it down. Well, the poor guy starts crying. The big guy says, "Oh, come on, man. I was just joking. Here, I'll buy you another drink. I can't stand to see a man cry." "Oh, you don't understand," said the first fellow. "This day is the worst day of my life. First, I sleep through the alarm this morning and get into the office late, and my boss fires me on the spot. I leave the building to go to my car and find that just in a few minutes that I had been inside, it had been stolen. And the police were no help. They say I'm probably out of luck. So I get a cab to return home, and when I leave it, I realize that I've left my wallet and all my credit cards on the back seat. I try to get the cabbie's attention as he drives away, but oh no, off he goes. So I get inside the house much earlier than anyone had expected, and surprise, honey, I'm home. I find my wife has packed her bags and left me. So I leave the house and come to this bar. I stood here seriously thinking for 30 minutes about ending it all, and I was ready to do it. And then you show up and drink my poison." How about that? Let me ask you a question. Have you ever really had a bad day where nothing seems to go right? We probably all have, more than a few, I suspect. If you've been with us these past weeks, you know that Jonah was right there with us as well, and the guy at the bar. In fact, he has just had several bad days in a row, hasn't he? He was running from God. There was a big storm at sea. The sailors threw him overboard. He nearly drowned and was swallowed by this giant sea monster. And then last week we talked about him being beached by an involuntary amesistic reaction. In other words, that fish that swallowed him puked him out on the shore. And it's hard to even fathom all of that, is it not? So try to imagine what Jonah's thought process must have been as he's sitting on this beach. He's just been spit out of the mouth of this big fish, and here he is sitting there. Surely he has some regrets from his past, thinking about how he could have avoided all the hardship and pain if only he had obeyed God, right? By the way, do you ever do that? I mean, have you ever disobeyed God in some way, and then you come to your senses and you realize how much time and effort you had wasted in that ridiculous behavior? Where you also regret some things in your past and wonder, what was I thinking? Let's talk about that for a few minutes today. What happens when, like Jonah, we can't get past our past? Well, when that happens, I first of all have to remember that in spite of my past, God always gives me second chances. That's a good thing, right? The downside to disobedience is that we never get back the time we wasted in sin, and we most usually will still deal with the consequences. Would you agree? However, the upside is that no matter what the circumstances, God always forgives and always gives us opportunities to begin again. Now, I would wager that some of you watching today have experienced at least a few Jonah-sized regrets in your life. Regrets about some financial decision or career decision or parenting or relationship decision. And if so, you have longed for another shot, haven't you? You've longed for a do-over, right? And you're not alone in that, because some of the most famous personalities of the Bible, in fact, are right there with you. Like King David. You remember his story, I'm sure. Here was a man who was the most powerful man in his nation, the most beloved man in his nation. A man who lied, a man who committed adultery, a man who murdered his best friend and wrecked his home. Yet, God called David the apple of his eye. Can you imagine? And those beautiful psalms like Psalm 32, Psalm 51, Psalm 23, get this, David wrote those after his failures. He wrote those after God forgave him and gave him also a second chance. Now listen, because God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, He will do for us just what he did for David and just what he's doing for Jonah. He'll give us second chances, second opportunities to get up and begin anew. And here's something else. The pain that Jonah endured in the storm and in the belly of the fish, it worked to his advantage as well, because it not only led him back to God's will for his life, it also made people stop what they were doing and listen to his message. In fact, let me read a few verses to you in chapter 3, beginning in the first verse. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now remember, he disobeyed the first time he got a word from God. Now he's obeying. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming out loud, by the way, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. And the Ninevites believed God. Now, why did they listen as Jonah stopped at every street corner to deliver his sermon? Well, I think one reason was because Jonah's 72-hour fish stomach acid bath would have had quite a change to his appearance. His skin was probably bleached white, as was his hair, unless the acid burned it off completely. His clothes were probably bleached and worn as well and full of holes. In other words, Jonah's appearance when he reached Nineveh indicated something unusual had happened to him. And the Ninevites knew right off, this guy's not from around here. Now think about it. If you lived in Nineveh and a hairless albino man walked up and said, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overturned, wouldn't you listen? I would. I mean, I might think he was a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs kind of a guy and stand a good distance away from him to give me a head start if I had to run, but I would hear him out. By the way, that reminds me, I saw last week a great T-shirt. I'm trying to order it right now. The front of it says, I don't run. If you see me running, you should run too, because something is probably chasing me. Now, I imagine Jonah had a few people running away from him as well, hoping that he would not chase them. Anyway, old scary Jonah shows up, and these people were ready to listen because of the tough time and the pain that Jonah had endured. They knew that this guy had been through some trouble. Hey, I want to listen to him and see what he has to say. And listen, God does the same thing with our pain and hurt. He takes the bad in our life and he uses it to his advantage. Like Paul said in Romans 8:28, we know that in all things God works those things together for good to those who love him. So here's a good question. Don't you tend to listen and pay attention to people who've gone through great difficulties when they begin to share their story? I mean, I sure do. And why is that? Well, it's because they are more empathetic with those who are struggling with life issues, aren't they? And they understand better the tough times that I may be going through, because their difficulties have taught them that God is trustworthy and that they can rely on him when push comes to shove. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it was good that Jonah sinned, because that gave him a lot of pain, which then provided him a powerful testimony. No, I'm not saying that. I believe God could have used him even more powerfully if he had been obedient to his call in the first place. However, as Jonah learned, second chances are pretty powerful as well. Warren Bennis once wrote of a promising junior executive at IBM who was involved in a risky venture for the company and wound up losing $10 million in the gamble. Well, he was subsequently called into the office of Tom Watson Sr., the founder and leader of IBM for 40 years, a business legend. And he was called into his office, and this junior executive was overwhelmed with guilt and fear, and he just blurted out when he walked in, I guess you've called me here for my resignation. Here it is. I resign. Watson replied, you must be joking. I just invested $10 million educating you. I can't afford your resignation. Isn't that a great story? Hey, God has invested in us like that too. When He created us in His image, knowing we would have failures, knowing His Son Christ would go to the cross, He invested in us still. And He didn't have to. He just did. That's called grace. God's unmerited favor. That's God's character. It's His nature. That's who He is. R.T. Kendall has said, God is not obligated to any man, and insofar as Jonah is concerned, God did not even have to send wind, but He did. He did not have to prepare the fish, but He did. He did not have to eject Jonah from the fish, but He did. And He certainly did not have to come to Jonah a second time, but He did. What great words those are. Guys, listen, aren't you glad for those "but He did" times in your life? He didn't have to love us, but He did. He didn't have to meet our need, but He did. He didn't have to forgive our sins, but He did. He didn't have to give us hope, and He didn't have to give us access to an abundant life, but He did. Chapter 3, again, verse 1 says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, and go to this great city of Nineveh and proclaim the message that I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. So in spite of my past, God gives me second chances. And in spite of my past, number 2, God is not disappointed with me. Now, I know that's a shocker for some of you, but stay with me. If all you had to go on were these 3 verses I read a moment ago, you would never suspect that Jonah had ever fallen and failed God, would you? I mean, there's no mention of Jonah's failure, which is such a reminder of how God works. When He forgives, He never holds it against us in any way. Unlike us, sadly. I mean, if we were sending Jonah out in the world, with a message, it might read more like, these words might read more like, the word of Hailey came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh, but this time don't mess it up like you did last time, you putz. I mean, that's just how it would be if we were God. But thank God I'm not God, and neither are you. Yeah? You see, too many people live with a false assumption that God is disappointed in them when they sin and they fail. Could I just tell you that is so not true? In fact, I would tell you that it is impossible for God to be disappointed with you, no matter how far you fall. Because do you know what to disappoint means? It means to give someone an outcome other than what they expected. That's less than their hope. Now think about that. How can you give God an outcome that He didn't expect? God is omniscient, isn't He? That means He knows everything, including the time you and I will fail Him. That thing you did yesterday, Jesus already knew you were going to do it before you did it. The same thing with the thing you did today and the thing you will do tomorrow. Is that scary sounding to you? Actually, it should be encouraging, because even though He knows, He loves you still and will never give up on you and will never bring up your failure and never be disappointed with you. Now, that being said, I do believe, however, that God may often get disappointed for us, and there's a huge difference. He wants the best for us, right? Lives of joy and abundance and fulfillment, but He recognizes that we often choose paths that lead us away from those gifts and blessings. I had a friend who was an alcoholic, a drunk, and as he was close to death because of his drinking, he said to me, "A long time ago, I accepted the fact that I was a huge disappointment to God. It won't do me any good to pray now." I sat on the edge of his hospital bed as he told me that, and I was just preparing to pray for him when he said those words. Well, we argued about that for just a few minutes. I told him there was no way God was disappointed with him, that God loved him and had forgiven him. I said, God may be disappointed for you in that you missed out on so much that He had, but He's not disappointed in you. I don't think He ever truly believed me that day, although we did pray together and had a beautiful time. I don't think He believed me until He saw Jesus face to face about 4 days later. After His funeral, I thought about how, though God wasn't disappointed with him, He surely was disappointed for him. God did have so much more for him those last years. A healthy marriage, loving and stable home for his kids, good health, friends. But you know what? My friend never experienced those things. And that's still so sad to me. Well, let's move on. In spite of what there may be in your past, God gives second chances. Number two, He is never disappointed. And last of all, in spite of my past, I still have a Nineveh. I still have a mission from God that involves other people. Because second chances always involve our mission to do that, to take God's love and grace to others. Notice verse 3. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city, and it took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. The Ninevites believed God. In other words, they gave their lives to God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. Now, first of all, Nineveh is called a great city, and it was in many regards. Its size stretched for some 30 miles along the Tigris River, usually about 10 miles wide at any one point. It was so big that it took Jonah 3 days to walk across it. It was fortified by 100-foot walls that surrounded the entire city, wide enough on top for 3 chariots to race side by side. Isn't that something? What a wall, huh? In addition, chapter 4 says there were about 120,000 children in addition to the adults. So including the suburbs, we're talking well over 1 million people resided there. So Nineveh is a great city, a great place. But here's the deal. More than a place, it is a place filled with people. People for whom God obviously is concerned and cares for and wants Jonah to care for. And remember, Jonah was tentative about this assignment, to say the least. In fact, he took off running, trying to get away from the assignment initially, right? He had this, and the reason why was because he had this preconceived idea that these Ninevites were less than him, savages, undeserving of love and forgiveness, especially from his God, right? So in actuality, Jonah had given up on his assignment and these people even before he started. However, upon arrival, he discovers women and men just like him. People who were late for work and early to bed. People that did things just like he did them. People who liked to laugh and cry. People who liked to eat and drink. You see, you really can't judge a book by its cover, can you? Not all the time. By the way, I've discovered that there are some Christians who have really given up on their Nineveh, on their mission to people out there. Because it's like, to them, it's like, what's the use? I mean, that person will never come to Christ. They'll never listen to my message, to my faith story. In fact, that's what Jonah believed, and no doubt what everyone else in Israel believed about these Ninevites, about these Assyrians. But the Bible says every last one of them, men, women, children, even their animals, repented and worshiped God. How about that? So here's another question for you. Is there a person or group of people that you have in your life, but you've basically given up on them? Or maybe that you don't like all that much? I'm talking like an alcoholic parent, an abusive spouse, the children that terrorize your neighborhood, or that deranged neighbor, the criminal in prison, the coworker who's always trying to make you look bad, that person who's been mean to you or hurt you. And when it comes down to it, you just don't see any hope for that particular person, that particular Nineveh in your life. Here's the lesson. The lesson is, if Nineveh can repent, listen, anyone can. If Nineveh can come to God, anyone can come to God. No one is hopeless. So, my challenge for you today is this. Keep praying for those people in your life. Keep praying for the Nineveh that God has given you. Keep trusting God. Keep sharing the good news of Jesus with them, because through God, all things are possible. And we'll discover more about that next week when we get together to close this series out, all right? So happy that you joined me today. Thank you. If there's anything I can do for you, please let me know. You can email me at our website, newdaychurchbrandon.org, or you can contact me by personal message on any social media venue. I'll be happy to get back to you, pray for you, whatever it takes, okay? That's it for today. We'll see you soon. Have a blessed week. Bye-bye.